A couple days ago, I went to the Gucci tunnels of Vietnam, and I want to share today how the Viet Cong's tactics paved the way for pretty much every guerrilla fighter 60 years in the future. A fair warning for you guys, this video is going to confront some really heavy topics, but it's not meant to be political. It's only meant to show how the Vietnamese successfully resisted against the United States in a type of war I found myself in Iraq and Syria. But for complete transparency, the info that I was given on this tour was sided with the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese. I'm in Vietnam. But having that experience gave me a totally different perspective on a war that I was taught about in American schools.
They sat behind the door, they closed the door. When Americans came here, they kicked the door to open. The chat,
As I finally arrived in Gucci, after traveling from the Cambodian border, I was dropped off by a taxi to the visitor center for these tunnels. I walked into where I thought I was supposed to go, and I found a bunch of portraits of Viet Cong fighters. It showed off women fighters who served with the Viet Cong, a lot like the Yepige and the women fighters that were in Iraq with me. As I was enjoying these portraits and just walking around the temple, I found this tour guide who's really enthusiastic to see an American there. So he took me under his wing, and I just followed him. And he also took me back home in Saigon for free. So this guy's dope. Our next stop after the temple and the portraits was to actually see some of the American equipment that they destroyed, which was right outside one of the first entrances of these tunnels. There was Huey helicopters, M113s, which are being used by Ukrainian forces right now in Bakhmut and other areas. One of the first things I noticed was how shot up they were, yet a lot of the dents that they had weren't able to penetrate. So I think they are pretty effective. And I also got to see a tank that was completely shot up in a plane as well, which I guess crash landed perhaps. And overall it was wild to see.
I'm just worried about how fast. Would you like me to record Jay?
I've got him doing it right now. Thanks, appreciate the camouflage photo.
The construction for the tunnel system started in 1948 when the French recolonized Vietnam. And over the years, it gradually expanded into a network of 250 kilometers long.
About 250 kilometers.
And it even traveled all the way to the Cambodian border, about 70 kilometers away. So when we talk about the tunnel systems that are in the Gaza Strip or the ones that I was in Iraq, you can see just how manageable it is for guerrillas to build tunnels. The North had the North Vietnamese army and the backing and support from China and the Soviet Union. But instead of trying to fight a stalemate war against the US military by just having their professional army versus the South's professional army, they encouraged revolutionaries in the South to build camouflage tunnels and make actions against the American and South Vietnamese forces very close to their home. We're talking 50 kilometers away from the capital of the South. The South's capital of Saigon was eventually renamed to Ho Chi Minh City when the North captured it after the American withdrawal in 1975. But people still call it Saigon here sometimes. Moving on to the fun stuff. In Gucci specifically, it's about 18 meters above sea level, so the tunnels wouldn't flood. Whereas tunnels in the normal parts of Vietnam, which are just 2 meters above sea level, would have a much harder time going deeper to protect against bombings from B-52s and such. Something that was new to me that I learned was that these bases weren't always being used as homes and operation bases. They're oftentimes started by the villages themselves to protect against the bombing. It was like a bomb shelter. A lot like what we see in Eastern Europe, where under every apartment building there's a bomb shelter. And eventually the villagers who were really tired of this bombing would join the resistance, either by just conducting reconnaissance or actually grabbing a rifle and joining the resistance. So they would store a lot of these supplies in the tunnels, and then they'd invite guerrillas to go and expand the tunnels and become part of their network, their underground guerrilla network. Brother, so this would be like the commanders. Really interesting. We've got like a big map there. You've probably seen this in movies. Like We Were Soldiers, but yeah, pretty dope. Kind of reminds me of Iraq. Like I said earlier, they even used woman fighters. Sometimes they would actually grab arms and fight the Americans, but other times they would just act as reconnaissance, or at nighttime they'd lay mines. And they would do that because they knew that the Americans didn't really think women were going to be fighting them as infantry. Eventually, the American forces caught on to guerrillas hiding among the populace, so they bombed them when they saw them build up structures or cooking fires in areas of their operation, such as Gucci. So at the point of the American invasion in 1965, the Vietnamese were desperately tired of these invasions happening, where these countries were coming in, trying to force their will on their government and their way of life, which is understandable, in my opinion. To hammer this home a little bit more, the American bomber pilots, before returning home or to their airstrip, just 50 kilometers away in Saigon, they were required to drop their bombs before landing because of safety reasons and other reasons such as landing their aircraft with a lot of weight. So they would routinely drop them on Gucci since it was so close to their airstrips. They not only did this because it was so close to home, and after they're done doing a bombing mission to the north, right before they get to the airstrip, they can just drop off their weight. But it was also because they knew that the guerrillas were hiding in Gucci, and they knew that the villages were very sympathetic to the guerrillas. So they just used it as a place to drop all their munitions. These large bombing campaigns and dumping of unused ordnance on the villages obviously largely contributed to the local support of the guerrillas. A lot like what we see on the news right now, where Russia's purposely bombing Ukrainian infrastructure during the winter to freeze the populace, or the Turkish Air Force against the Kurds, and the Myanmar junta striking villages empathetic to the revolutionaries. The hearts and minds are won by the fighters living with the locals, not the American patrols that come once a week. You know what I mean? So this created a huge dilemma for the American military, who had to choose between bombing everything in sight but losing local support for the South, or not bombing and giving the guerrillas a chance to build up forces and launch a major attack. So a single tunnel base had pretty much everything you would need. They had living quarters, they had a kitchen, they had bunkers, but the kitchen really shows the engineering and the ingenuity of the Viet Cong. So I'm going to talk about this for a bit. A kitchen is a dead giveaway for soldiers and airmen searching for tunnels. The smell could usually be chased down by a trained dog, or the smoke could be seen from the air by helicopter gunships and jets. So the way that the Viet Cong dealt with this, because they need to eat 3 times a day, just like us, was to ventilate the kitchen and the tunnels to the outside through a series of small rooms they burrowed out from the tunnel, which would hold back the smoke enough, let it billow up a bit in one of the rooms until it slowly let out into the next room. And it released into a camouflaged air vent very slowly. And these air vents were often disguised as termite mounds, which are everywhere in Vietnam. So this way the smoke wouldn't all come out at once and give away their position to their biggest threat, the bombers. And to fight off the dogs, which were used by the American patrols to sniff out the tunnels, they put chili powder in the holes of the air vents so the search dogs would have their noses clogged up when they tried to sniff them out, which is kind of sad, but you know, war is war. Moving on from the kitchen, in the tunnels they also had bomb shelters, and they made them triangular so that way they could withstand the force of these bombs. The tunnels that I saw had everything that I had in Iraq, which you've already seen on my channel before. A kitchen, a room for sleeping, meeting places, logistics rooms, but instead of electricity, they had oil lamps. So, a little different, I guess. But the absolute worst part that came as a surprise for me was how hot they are. Because they're not as deep as the ones I had in Iraq, and they're not in mountains. They're on pretty much ground level. So yeah, it got really, really humid. So when you're moving around in this duck walking position for more than 50 meters, you are sweating your ass off, your legs burn. It really proved a point to me that the tunnel rats that the Americans used, like these smaller guys, they would still have to wear a belt. They'd still have to carry a rifle sometimes, maybe just a flashlight and pistol. But there's points where you have to crawl through it. So the Viet Cong really used their height disadvantage, a lot like me, to their advantage, which was kind of cool.
Sweet. Oh, thank you. I appreciate it.
As we walked to and from different tunnel entrances, we passed by dozens of B-52 bomb craters, which were still there after 60 years, which reminded me how many unguided bombs could be used because they're a lot less expensive than guided. Carpet bombing is relatively cheap compared to conventional laser-guided munitions we see today. The Vietnamese still to this day use the unexploded ordnance or the shrapnel that they find as scrap metal to sell. A single B-52 bomb would have its gunpowder sold to fishermen for some reason, and the scrap metal from the B-52 bomb brings in about 4 million Vietnamese dong, or $165, which is a lot of money out here. The Vietnamese not only revolutionized their country, but they revolutionized the tactics we see today because they were driven into the ground by the Americans. The Americans operated about 10,000 soldiers south of Gucci, so when the Americans patrolled up there, they'd usually only be met with guerrillas who pretended to be civilians, or they'd be met with well-planned ambushes.
Footprint service going. Confuse the enemy. Footprint service going.
The Viet Cong normally conducted their mine and trap placement or smuggling of supplies and setting ambushes at nighttime. So they were the ones who owned the night, especially because night vision capabilities were just they weren't there yet in 1970. They smuggled so many fighters and ammunition throughout the years, the tunnels even stretched to 20 kilometers from Saigon City. And because of that, they were able to launch the famous Tet Offensive. They continually conducted attacks, small and large. So overall, the Gucci tunnels that I saw, shit's crazy. It was a lot more crude than what I had even in Iraq. It had dangerous animals like bats and insects crawling inside the tunnels. But in my opinion, it's a testament to the Viet Cong's morale and the hearts and minds goal. And near the end of our tour, we went to the booby trap section, which our tour guide loved, and I didn't love so much, but I didn't tell him I was an American Marine.
You should trap to hunt enemy, hunt American. Yeah, you see. Okay.
Like these sharpened bamboo sticks and these spike traps and stuff, but there's not really evidence that they're used everywhere. The big one though was the mines. So they had a lot of unexploded ordnance, they had a lot of mines that were coming from the Soviet Union being donated, and that was the biggest fear for the American soldiers, much more so than these traps that you see on the internet. So this brings us to modern day Vietnam, 2023. The country is now highly built up, and is planning purchases of American F-16s and other equipment. The Americans see the opportunity to make relations better since Vietnam's neighbor, China, is claiming much of the South China Sea off their coast as their own. Something that might be news to you, and was news to me when I went there, was that China invaded Vietnam, like right after the Vietnam-American War. Vietnam actually invaded Cambodia after the American-Vietnam War because they were in the middle of a genocide of its own people under Pol Pot, as well as attacking Vietnamese civilians, with 3,000 Vietnamese civilians dying in the Ba Truc massacre from the Khmer Rouge government in Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge continuously planned to invade Vietnam, and they actually did this in a couple occasions, including this island that's on the border. So Vietnam finally responded by ousting the Communist Party of Kampuchea, and it's low-key one of the only invasions I would support in all of history. But the problem was that China was allied with Cambodia, and they wanted to make a two-front war to distract the Vietnamese and hopefully get them to pull out of Cambodia. But once the Chinese did that, they didn't really take the bait. They stayed to the lowlands and they stayed away from the cities, and they kind of let China do this fake war, and they finished their mission. So yeah, the Vietnamese literally pulled off 3 invasions of their country in like a decade. Today, relations between the Americans and the Vietnamese is getting a lot better, as the older populace are being replaced by a younger generation heavily influenced by American culture and capitalism. Although it's a socialist country, the government is indistinguishable with most Southeast Asian countries I've been to, including Indonesia, and they're a rising industrial superpower replacing China's export grip, which is again why China is so afraid of Vietnam right now. Vietnam is a reunified nation, with the South filled with people who want a more Western capitalist way of life, and the North being more socialist and sympathetic towards the current government. So I've been in Vietnam for a little over a month now, and I've got to say, I'm really impressed with the way that they dealt with all these wars in the past, and how they're moving on from that, growing their economy, investing into their defense, and making friends all over the world. Not only in America, but all of Southeast Asia. If there's anything that I want you to get from this video, it's that Vietnam is a very different country than it was 60 years ago. They're highly patriotic, they love their country, and they're trying their absolute best to fit into a role that they found themselves in. And I think we can all learn something from Vietnam today, not only in the military sense, but just in their way of life. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something. If you did, you can always subscribe or become a member and get some exclusive videos that I took while I'm in Vietnam. And I really hope you guys enjoyed. So I'll talk to you guys in the next one. Thanks so much for listening. Peace.
Sorry.